Erika, you mentioned the fact that you wanted me to comment a little bit on the current pandemic and what is, in my opinion, likely going to happen in the very near future. And we have about 20 minutes, is that correct, including the time of exchange with the students?
Yes, it's 20 minutes. I think could be like a little bit more if you want, and then like questions from my classmates and I.
Certainly. Well, there's basically 5 points that I think are worth mentioning to begin this discussion. The first one is that this pandemic, as we have all seen, has demonstrated the Western countries, in particular the United States, which is, as of today, the current epicenter of the epidemic. Europe hasn't done much better. And so the first conclusion we can see here is that two old centers of powers have clearly lost ground. Images that will stay in mind are images of hospitals that can no longer handle the number of patients they receive. There are images of disorderly conduct, people massively refusing to obey the mask mandates or all of these things, while at the exact same moment, in the exact same conditions, different nations have behaved fundamentally differently and have obviously been a lot more successful. We can, of course, think of China, with one question mark regarding China, because in reality, who knows? I certainly don't know exactly what is happening in China. They are not the champions of freedom of speech or freedom of press. So it's a bit difficult to assess the situation in China with actual facts. But what matters in geopolitics is also, of course, the image. And the image of China being so a country that has been incredibly successful to manage its pandemic. Also the image of a country that has, in a very intelligent way, used its massive resources to help other countries. One example that jumps to mind when I talk about this is Chinese and Russian airplanes landing in Italy to bring supplies at a moment when Europe was unable to help its own members. And the use of charitable actions and international assistance has actually, in the case of China, become a political move. It's not so much about helping people, but to make the clear demonstration that Europe and the US are inefficient and that Chinese has incredible efficiency. But again, there might be a very big difference between reality and what we see. Now, the third thing that I think is really worth mentioning is the emergence, whether it's manipulated or not, of a very large number of conspiracy theories around this pandemic. And I think that's also a political fact that we should take into account. I've heard all of them, from the laboratory in Wuhan that may or may not be owned by Bill Gates, George Soros and his master plan to control the universe, and the willingness of states to control the old population, eliminating the elderly to balance public accounts, the spread of the virus through 5G antennas or traces of HIV in the virus. All of these things are all fake. Now, I'm not sure who invents them, but I'm very sure of who distributes this fake information. And we've seen before in 2016 with the American election that saw Trump rise to power. We saw that a troll farm in Ukraine was able to actually modify an election in the most powerful democracy of the planet. So all of these conspiracy theories are, in my opinion, also a political action that matters and should be taken into account. They have one goal: to weaken trust. And weakening trust in a time of pandemic is an incredibly powerful tool. I'll get back to that in a minute, if you don't mind. But also, let's try maybe to understand why these idiotic conspiracy theories are so successful. It's not that people are stupid. It's not that they are gullible. It's that there is a problem of unbalance. You know, humans need balance to understand things. No one can believe that some loser could kill Kennedy. It doesn't balance. No one can believe that 11 terrorist crazy guys can actually bring down the World Trade Center. It doesn't balance. In our mind, as humans, we're always constantly trying to find balance to accept and understand things. And when events are too big to be explained by something that's smaller than the thousandth of a hair, a small virus that we don't understand, it's neither alive or dead, it's a creature that's very mysterious to science still at this point. It just doesn't compute. It doesn't balance. And people are trying to balance things with these conspiracy theories. So it's not that we're idiots or that we are gullible. It's that we need something else, that this small little tiny thing that is actually shaking the world. That's why those theories are being successful. Now, the fourth thing I would like to address and put on the table for an open discussion are the perspectives. What can we expect in the next 5, 10 years? Now that we see a vaccine is coming, now that we begin to see that hopefully within 3 to 6 months, the world will get back to a more normal situation. What is to be expected? Well, first, we must remember that geopolitical tensions were already extremely high before the pandemic. They were high because of the Trump presidency. They were high because of China's ambition. They were high because of many, many conflicts that are currently open in the world. They are not being managed in a proper way. Sorry, my phone is ringing. Let me start this thing. So yes, we have high tensions before the pandemic, and they have been sharply increased by the pandemic. And in my opinion, along with the mounting criticism of globalization, we've seen a return of nationalism and my country first policies all over the world, from South America to Europe, Asia, and the United States. And as this virus is disrupting both our economic situation and our daily lives, as people are struggling financially, not just in regards to their health, it is unfortunately to be expected that nationalist movements will continue to gain ground after, as an after effect of this pandemic, especially as citizens are forced to isolate themselves. When we are isolated, we are more subject to political manipulation than we would be if we were living a normal life and communicating with normal people as we usually do. And you should also remember that every major epidemic in the past 1,000 years has led to fundamental changes in political organization of nations. For example, if you look at the Great Plague of the 14th century in Europe, which reduced Europe's population by 1/3. Imagine the effect of losing 1/3 of the population of an entire continent in just a few years. Well, this pandemic contributed to a radical new questioning on the old continent. Since people saw that the political order in place, the monarchy, and the power of the church had actually not been able to protect them from a pandemic, they began to question the system of power. And instead of a society dominated by religious right, a system of law that is produced by religion. It was replaced by a system of law that was defended by the police, that was seen as a much more effective way to control people's life. And the modern state, as we know it today, scientific spirit, were born as a consequence, as a shock wave of this enormous tragedy of the 14th century plague. Both refer to the same source, the questioning of the religious and political authority of the church, unable to save lives or even to give meaning to death. And all of a sudden, the policeman and the modern state as we knew it replaced the priests as the dominant force to organize society. So my point is that in a few centuries, we have moved from an authority based on faith to an authority based on the respect of force. And then later to a more effective authority based on the respect of the rule of law. And I could take many examples in history that tell us the same story. When a great disaster occurs, political powers fall, and they are being replaced by something else. Now, of course, a terrible scenario would be that the replacement is the nationalist movements I've mentioned earlier, carried by the conspiracy theories. And that, unfortunately, may happen in several countries, including in the West, as the West proves incapable of mastering the tragedy that we are facing. And so our system of authority based on the protection of individual rights could collapse in several countries. And with it, the mechanisms that were put in place, the market, democracy, ways of sharing the wealth and the resources that we hold. And if Westerners fail, we could see the establishment not only of authoritarian surveillance regimes using artificial intelligence technologies very effectively, but also of authoritarian resource allocation regimes based purely, solely on the distribution and the allocation of food or other resources as they become more difficult to manage if the market falls. So should we freak out? Should we be scared? My answer is no. We should not freak out and we should not be scared. We will see, in my opinion, the birth, after a moment of profound questioning of authority, maybe in some countries, authoritarian regression, in an attempt to keep the chains of power in place. But they are not legitimate. And everyone can see today that the nations that have best handled the pandemic are not nations that were carried by nationalistic movements. They are nations that are profoundly humanistic in nature. And if you look at the leaders who have best handled this pandemic, you'll see a young woman, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. You will see Angela Merkel, again, a woman. The majority of those who have done a good job are women. I don't think it's a matter of sex. I think it's a matter of being humanist, having the ability to impose generosity as the best possible way to manage a tragedy. People will see good results and bad results. People are seeing the bad results of Trump. 1 million new cases of virus per day. People will also see New Zealand. They will see Vietnam. They will see Germany. They will see Hong Kong. They will see all of these countries that have been incredibly successful, not just on a health level, but on a sanitary level, but also on an economic level. And when people see that some systems are working better than others, then I am absolutely convinced, and it's not because I'm optimistic, but I'm convinced that they will want systems that work well, systems that show empathy for others, systems that put an emphasis on health, hospitality, food, education, ecology, relying on large networks of energy and information production and circulation. So I believe that in a few years, those humanistic systems that show empathy will dominate at least the Western world and probably large portions of South America. I think that as individuals, we are changing because of this pandemic. I think that we will stop frantically buying useless things and return to more essential ways of living our lives. That's one of the lessons of the pandemic. It's also shown us the value of time. And our notion of time has been changed fundamentally. And we're learning how to best use our time on this planet, which we are recognizing as rare and precious because we've seen death. So the time that we hold, because we're not dead, and hopefully none of us is sick, that time ain't value. We'll probably be playing less video games and doing more meaningful things. That's what I believe. I also believe that our job, especially your job, because you're the generation that will take power in 10 years. So you might as well start now to prepare the world that you will be leading. Your role is to make this transition as smooth as possible. Don't inherit a field of ruins if you can. And the sooner you implement these type of strategies, the sooner we get out of this pandemic and the terrible economic crisis that will follow. So these are my 5 points. I hope I didn't bore you to death. But the one point that I really want to emphasize here is that things are probably going to get a little bit worse for many of us over the next few months. But I have great hopes that the wonderful examples of humanity that have been demonstrated by some nations will serve as the leading examples for the rest of the world. And this type of tragedy will, of course, change political power, like all tragedies have in our history. But it could change it for the better. In reality, one could easily argue that it is better to ask a judge to regulate society than it is to ask a priest to regulate society, and to ask the priest to remain in his position, which is a position of helping us with our spirituality, not with our legal system. And so it turned out to be a better option for Europe, this plague that I described earlier in the 14th century. And maybe this one here can also be an opportunity to build a better world in reality. Look at this. Look at what we're doing. Who would have thought a year ago that some guy that Erika met in France as a professor a couple of years ago would be speaking at a moment when I should be eating with my children and my dog, would be speaking to people on the other side of the world and trying to share my ideas for whatever they're worth. This is something new, and this will last. This means that education, collaborative international education, without even moving out of your apartment, is an actual reality. And it's just the beginning. And yet it's working. Imagine what we can do with this 5 years from today. It's wonderful what could be done. And with education, you should always consider that it is always the first stepstone of democracy and freedom and human development. It starts with it. I don't see anyone asleep yet. So I hope those few ideas and concepts were interesting and I didn't waste too much of your time. And if you have questions, by all means, I'll be very, very happy to answer them.
Thank you, Professor Finck. Now I will be participating for a while. Let me introduce myself. My name is Ms. Sandoval. I am the professor. I am the teacher of these young students. I look young, but I'm not that young. I'm 50. So I really appreciate, first of all, you taking the time of your family. We know because of the time difference, this makes, of course, challenging for many of our guests the ones being in Korea sometimes, in the States or in different countries to be with us. So we truly and really appreciate you sharing your opinion with these young generations. As you mentioned, I also know and I am aware that I will not be here to see maybe many of these things that will be happening in the next decades. But I know that what you, Professor Finck, and myself try to do every day in our classrooms are setting the base for a new future, new generation. And I am very proud of our students here. We have students from different areas. It's an interdisciplinary group in which we have students from the management, international relations, architecture, marketing. So being such an interdisciplinary group, it is very important for us in this part of our semester to hear different opinions from different people, to hear different perspectives. But I want to confirm before I now give the microphones to the students. I hope their questions are ready. Students, please, because once I'm finished, you will be asking your questions. I think you have totally exceeded our expectations with what you have shared. It is very clear that you are a very experienced person in your area of expertise, of course. And once again, I really and truly appreciate you taking the time to share your opinion with our students. Thank you very much, Professor Finck. And now, students, I would like you to raise your hand. Yes, Michelle, I know you have a question. Anybody else has a question? Irving? Then we'll go to Michelle first. Then we'll go to Irving. And if anybody else has a question, just raise your hand after Michelle's question and Irving's question. Michelle, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Michelle, and my question is about the systems that you talk about. How can we know, or how do we know if the system is correct built or it's going to work correctly?
We don't know. What the best we can do when we work with perspective as a science is to gather data available to us. And when we have enough data using mathematical models, we project it over time. It's a new science perspective. It was basically founded in Canada at McGraw-Hill University 20 years ago. 20 years is very young for science. And what this science is attempting is not to predict the future. That can't be done. But what this science is teaching us is that there are likely scenarios that are going to happen if you project the existing data 5, 10, 15 years into the future. So to answer your question, Michelle, we don't know what will happen, but we know we can measure things that work and things that don't work. For example, we know that some governments have been able to maintain a properly working economy during the pandemic. Others have not. And those that were able to maintain it were those who, whether you call it socialism or whatever, it's not about ideology, it's about economics and mechanics. There are countries in Europe, for example, like France, where the government decided to incredibly increase our national debt because no one lost their job, because everybody got paid even if they were not working, because people who have a small business receive 2,000 euros per month so they could survive, even if their shops were closed. You can imagine when you do this for 6 months, how much money it's costing. But then what do you get in front of this incredible financial effort? You get a nation that is not currently in turmoil. You get a nation that as soon as this pandemic is over, is ready to start again, because we don't have 5 million people who are unemployed, because no one is dying of hunger in our streets. Of course, people are suffering, but right now they're not suffering of economic problems. They're suffering of health problems for which we see a solution coming soon. We see that is working. And we see that the nations that have abandoned their people and relied on the pure economics of capitalism and the market to take care of people during the pandemic, that has not worked well. And those nations are in bigger difficulties because they're combining economic difficulties to health difficulties. What we also see is that governments that put a focus on hospitals, universal healthcare, have had far better results dealing with the pandemic than governments that did not. So I'm not advocating socialism. Again, this is not a political idea that I'm advocating or defending. It's behavior. And regardless of your political tendencies or ideas, you can be humanistic and be on the right. That's irrelevant. But what we see are facts, data, that some countries are doing good, others are doing bad. So once we know this with perspective, we project possible scenarios into the future, and it becomes possible not with certainty, but with a high level of probability to realize that it will take a long time for America to recover, that Europe will be more divided than ever, with nations that are doing much better after the pandemic than others. And we can see a nation like New Zealand, whom none of us could put on a map a year ago, beginning a nation that shows a model that will inspire many. And so when we project all of this in the future, Michelle, we can estimate that the nations that are doing poorly today are the most likely to be the victim of nationalistic movements, authoritarian movements, and those who are doing good are less likely. But again, no one can predict the future.
Thank you, Professor.
Your question. I hope I answered your question, Michelle. Sorry if I was a bit long.
No. Please take all the time you want. It is an honor, honestly, to have you here with us. It is an honor. It is. Actually, we are recording, with your permission, of course, this session, because we're going to share it later in our YouTube channel. So you can watch it or you can share it later, because I think these words of wisdom that you're sharing with us are so powerful that I just hope and I wish more students, not only the ones we have here, can actually learn and actually gain from your experience as well, Professor. Thank you. Now, Irving, you have a question. Irving, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, my name is Irving, and my question is about the new Sea Road. Some people think it will facilitate the development of forgotten regions, but some others believe it is a tool to dominate Europe. As a European, what do you think will be the impact of the new Sea Road on your continent?
It's a very good question, Irving, and it's also a very complicated question. So I'll try to be brief and synthetic. First, you must understand that Europe, even though it is in many ways united on an economic level, for example, is not in reality politically united. For example, yesterday, the most important budget ever designed by the European community worth almost 2,000 billion euros, the largest expense ever organized in Europe to bring relief from the pandemic to each European country, an effort that every European citizen is waiting for. That was blocked yesterday. The budget was not passed because two minor nations, minor on a political level, Poland and Hungary, blocked this budget for political reasons. So don't believe that Europe is a united area. It's not. And it shows this every day. The second thing that I want to mention on Europe before I answer your question is the incredible inability that Europe as an institution demonstrated during the pandemic. If there is one moment when every citizen of Europe is actually hoping that Europe, this faraway institution, can actually do something, it's when disaster arrives. And Europe was unable to do anything. It did a little bit, but no one saw it. What we saw were Chinese airplanes landing in Italy, to bring masks and to help locally. So this has hurt terribly the political unity of Europe, to not see Europe as a power that can help. And even at the moment when the solution now is money, we need 2,000 billion euros for Europe to restart. Even that, it's unable to do it. So Europe appears weak and China appears strong. And China is using, of course, in the political, its prestige gained during the pandemic. I keep mentioning the Chinese airplanes landing in Italy. Why? Because China needs Italy for its Silk Road. And if you are an Italian citizen and you see a far, far away Europe that has not helped you, except with stupid regulations that you don't even understand, and you see a China that has brought relief, as an Italian citizen, I fully understand that you're ready to make deals with China to sell harbors, to sell roads, and to allow them to continue building their Silk Road. If you're Greek, you feel exactly the same way, and you're very happy with China buying your largest harbor in the country. So to try and answer your question, Irving, right now, all the cards seem to be in the hands of China. It has prestige, it has a plan, it has money, it has dominated the virus. It looks like China has all the cards. But there is one element that we should never forget in geopolitics: people's will. If you ask the citizens of Europe a slightly different question, one that doesn't talk about money, but one that talks about fundamental rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of enterprise. If you ask people if they want to be traced by a giant artificial intelligence that gives you a social score that will or not enable you to take a plane, travel outside of your city, or do normal things in your life, like they have in China. If you ask people if it's okay to reinvent a new form of concentration camps in China for Muslims, the Uyghur people, if you ask people about of freedom, democracy, and liberty, then they quickly forget all the economic gains that China can bring, and most of them go back to saying, we should be friendly with China, but we should help them move towards a better society, accompany them, not insult them, not humiliate them on the world stage, but work as closely as possible with them to bring what's good in our system to them, but also to show them the respect of taking what's good in their system and bring it into ours. So I sound naive when I say this, but in reality, as long as Europe is a democracy, you will have a majority of people who will lean towards freedom and human rights, and a minority of people who will be ready to sell them out for a little bit more money from China. So finally, to answer your question, Irving, it's not done. China hasn't won yet. Its Silk Road is still a project. It's a brilliant idea, but there will be resistance in Europe, and I'm not sure China will win.
Thank you so much for your sharing and answering this very interesting question, Professor Finck. I think we only have time for one more question. I don't know if any of the students would like to ask any question. Otherwise, if we don't have more questions, I will give the microphone back to Erika. If there's anything else that you would like to add, Erika. Oh, Elisa. Are you, what's that?
If we can.
I cannot see you, Elisa. I'm sorry. Yes, Grant, give me a second. I'll go to Elisa, and if we still have time, I'll go to you, Grant. Yes, Elisa, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Elisa, and this will be quick because you mentioned that we have like the duty to make this transition to a humanistic orientation as smooth as possible. But how can we divided countries? Like in one country, you can find different like harsh problems inside it.
Yes. And the problems that your country is facing are fundamentally different from the problems other countries are facing. I'm fully aware of that. One way that has always shown to be efficient is individual behavior. We all feel when we do something on our own that it has absolutely no importance on a political or a social level. We always forget that an ocean is made of tiny little drops. And so what I want to say, Elisa, is that maybe you won't have the opportunity to vote and change things quickly. I don't know what the calendar of political vote is in Mexico. Obviously, that's one way of doing things, but it's not the only one. Every time you make a choice when you buy something, you make a political decision. Every time you help or not people who need help, you make a social decision. Every time you share your ideas with someone, regardless of the medium that you use, you make a political move. That's what I'm talking about. Those individual actions and behavior that can actually change things if enough people share them. And a time of turmoil, a time of shock, a time of chaos is a time when new voices can be heard. So make your voice heard. That's simple in reality.
Thank you very much, Professor. And now, finally, I will give the microphone to Grant. Go ahead, Grant. Grant, are you there? Okay, I think we lost Grant, and that's okay.
Disconnected really quick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you, Grant. Ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if this would really be your area, but I was wondering what you thought about how like COVID in the future will affect like the international supply chains. Do you think that this is going to make force companies to be more have like more ethical policies and such with where they're sourcing their factories and materials, especially moving away from China and moving more locally? Or?
Yes, that's a great question, Grant. I'll try and answer briefly. What this pandemic demonstrated is that global logistics don't work in case of a tragedy. We all relied on a global supply chain that stopped working at the moment China was no longer delivering, that stopped working at the moment when we realized that 80% of medical supplies used in Europe were coming from Asia. We didn't know that until the pandemic. All of a sudden, we realized that two logics were actually opposed. One is the logic of finance, global logistics, producing things wherever it's cheaper and most efficient to make them, has its own logic purely designed to make money. This is the logic that took over after the 2007 crisis. Companies had to make more money. It accelerated because there had been a financial crash. We realized with this pandemic that this logic does not work in our favor in times of crisis. So I believe that very much like after the shock of the 2007 economic crisis, the shock of the 2020 pandemic crisis will force businesses and governments to produce new policies. Governments will make sure that we no longer run out of masks because they are made 20,000 kilometers away. It's their duty. Companies will realize that although they are saving a few dollars by making product on the other side of the planet, they're wasting billions when the supply chain stops because there's sand in the machine. And it's not good business anymore to do that. They've understood this. And so if your question was to ask, can we expect companies to start producing locally? Yes. Can we expect companies to take better care of their home because now they're producing locally? Yes, because you may not be concerned as a CEO of the pollution you create in India with your factory, but you're very, very concerned of the pollution you're producing in your own river in front of your house. So it's not by will, it's not out of ethics, it's out of good sense that business is going to be brought back because it just works better, and that's what the pandemic has demonstrated. And when business is brought back, ethical laws and human rights are now directly affecting the means of production, which means they change them. So they become more ethical and more respectful, of course, of the environment and local laws. I hope I answered your question, Grant.
Thank you. Could I follow up another thing, or do we have to?
Go ahead, Grant. Go ahead.
Do you think the government's role to obligate on national to Biden just released a message a couple of days ago that entering into the presidency, he's going to use the power of, what is it called? It's a power that's usually used by the government during the war to obligate national manufacturing companies to manufacture certain goods for the good of the society. Do you think that in general, should be the responsibility of the government to give incentives to their own national companies to, when normally not big weapons, for example, but in this situation to make personal protective gear and things like that? Or do you think the companies should want to do it out of their own interests?
I will respond quickly with two things. The first one is that when it's an exception, it works. It worked for America during World War II to completely reorganize its economy and its production towards the war effort. It made them win. It saved the world. So on an exceptional basis, the government reorganizing completely the means of production to face a difficult situation or even a tragedy, that has worked in the past. And my feeling is that it will work again, but only as an exceptional situation. As a rule, outside of the tragedy, then the only incentive that governments should be giving is a tax incentive. If, as a government, you represent the people, and if the will of the people is to have less pollution, is to have more local jobs, is to have a higher minimum wage, or the exact opposite, whatever the will of the people is in a democracy, the job of the government is to carry that will and make it a reality into the economic world. And the best way to do it is through taxation. Eliminate taxes on tomatoes that are produced in your village. Tax the tomatoes that travel 5,000 kilometers to get to your house. By doing those simple tax things, you actually have an enormous impact on the way economy and society function. But only do it, as a rule in general, according to what the people gave you, according to the mandate that people have given to you. Don't do it out of ideology, but if people vote as a majority for certain policies, the easiest way to translate those policies is through taxation, and that's when government should actually play a role in our lives, in my opinion, of course.
Thank you so much, Professor. And now we have taken so much time. I'm so sorry. Please thank your family for the time that they are also being open for you to be here. So, Erika, that'll be it. If you want to say the final words, thank you so much, Professor Finck. Let's give a virtual applause to Professor Finck, everyone, please. And now, Erika, I'll give you the microphone. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you again, as Adam said, for your time. And I think it was very enlightening for us, this talk we had with you. Because this subject, I felt it was very interesting for us to hear from you, because now the moment in time is worth talking about what would happen and what has happened. So thank you very much.
It has been a great pleasure. Don't worry, my children are not starving. They're okay. And thank you. You kept talking about honor. The honor is for me. Again, for an old man like me, to realize all of a sudden a few kids in Mexico who are interested in whatever I have to say, the honor is for me. So thank you. Good luck. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. And the best of luck to all of you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. You're going to make us cry. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. We're going to take a 10-minute break. See you here in 10 minutes, okay? Thank you.
En comercio exterior por la Universidad.